It was a rainy autumn afternoon in the quiet town of Ashland, Oregon. The skies hung heavy with thick gray clouds, and a persistent drizzle turned the cracked sidewalks into slippery trails. The air was cold, biting even, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you want to hide under blankets all day. But amidst the murmur of the rain and the rustle of the wind through the brittled trees, there was a faint sound that could easily be missed if you weren't paying attention. A tiny, desperate meow. At the edge of a dimly lit alley behind an old gas station, a kitten huddled against a discarded cardboard box. The creature was heartbreakingly small, its fur matted and soaked from the relentless rain. Its eyes, barely visible beneath the grime and sadness, reflected fear and pain. It was alone, truly, utterly alone. Whoever had left it there, whoever had deemed its life disposable, was long gone, leaving behind a trembling soul that didn't yet know the world could be cruel. On the other side of town, a scruffy, golden-furred dog named Theo trotted through the empty streets. Theo had no home, no collar, and no one to love him. At least not anymore. He had once belonged to someone, that much was clear. His coat, though dirty now, had once been well-groomed, and his eyes still held a glimmer of hope that spoke of days spent chasing balls and being called a good boy. But those days were over. Theo had been abandoned months ago, left to fend for himself. And yet, unlike most stray dogs who grew weary and untrusting of humans, Theo carried an inexplicable kindness in his heart. It was as if he knew, even in his loneliest moments, that there was still good in the world, even if it hadn't been shown to him lately. The town's residents often saw Theo wandering about. Sometimes he would linger near the diner, waiting for scraps. Other times he'd rest in the park, lying under the benches and watching as families played with their dogs. But on this particular evening, as the rain came down harder and the world grew darker, Theo's path led him somewhere unexpected. As he wandered past the gas station, his ears perked up. The faint meow reached him, cutting through the sound of the rain. Theo stopped in his tracks, his head tilting to the side as he listened again. Another meow, this time softer but more urgent. Without hesitation, Theo followed the sound, his paws splashing through puddles as he sniffed the air, searching. His heart, big and full of unspent love, knew what it was before his eyes found the tiny creature. And then he saw it, the kitten, no bigger than a shoebox, curled up and trembling. Theo approached slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. The kitten looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes, its tiny body tensing as if expecting the worst. But Theo didn't growl or bark. Instead, he lowered himself onto his haunches, sniffing the kitten gently. The little one flinched at first, but then, sensing no harm, relaxed just slightly. Theo did something extraordinary then. He lay down beside the kitten, curling his large body around its frail frame. His thick fur acted as a shield, protecting the kitten from the relentless rain and the cold wind. The kitten pressed into him, instinctively seeking warmth, and for the first time in what was probably its short life, it felt safe. But their moment of peace was short-lived. From the shadows of the alley emerged a man. He was tall, with unkempt hair and a scowl that seemed permanently etched into his face. He had a reputation in town for being cruel, especially to animals. People whispered about the things he'd done, the dogs he'd scared off with stones, the cats he'd chased away with sticks. And now he stood just a few feet away from Theo and the kitten, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "Get out of here," the man barked, his voice harsh and threatening. He took a step closer, raising his foot as if to kick Theo away. The dog didn't budge. Instead, Theo stood up, placing himself squarely between the man and the kitten. His body tensed, his ears flattened, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. It wasn't an aggressive growl, but a warning. A clear message that he would protect this kitten, no matter the cost. The man sneered, his frustration growing. "You think you're tough, mutt?" he spat, picking up a rusted metal rod from the ground. "Let's see how tough you are now." The rain fell harder, drumming against the pavement like a somber rhythm of impending danger. Theo stood firm, his eyes locked on the man. The kitten, sensing the tension, let out a tiny, frightened mewl from behind him. Theo didn't look back. He couldn't. His focus was entirely on the man in front of him, on the threat that loomed closer with each step. In that moment, Theo wasn't just a stray dog. He wasn't just a lost soul wandering the streets. He was a protector, a guardian, and he would give everything he had to keep the kitten safe. The rain pounded harder, soaking Theo's golden fur as he stood his ground. The kitten trembled behind him, its small cries barely audible over the drumming of water against the pavement. Theo's growl deepened, his lips curling back just enough to show his teeth. It wasn't aggression, it was desperation. He wasn't a fighter, but instinct had taken over. He understood that the little life behind him depended entirely on his courage. The man, still clutching the rusted rod, took another menacing step forward. His voice was sharp, laced with cruelty. "Move, dog, or I'll make you regret it." He swung the rod lightly, testing his grip, his face twisted in irritation. He didn't see two vulnerable creatures trying to survive. He saw nuisances, something to be rid of, like trash on the side of the road. Theo didn't flinch. His legs were stiff, his body tense, but his eyes betrayed something deeper. Fear. He was afraid, yes, but not for himself. His life had been nothing but hardship for months now. He had little left to lose. But the kitten hadn't even had a chance to begin. It was barely hanging on, its ribs visible beneath its dirty fur. Theo knew he had to protect it, no matter what. The man raised the rod higher this time, and Theo barked sharply, a loud, commanding sound that echoed through the narrow alley. The man hesitated for a second, startled by the intensity of the bark, but then his scowl deepened. "Fine," he snarled, stepping closer. "Have it your way." What happened next felt like it played out in slow motion. The man swung the rod with force, aiming to strike Theo, but the dog moved with surprising agility, dodging the first blow. He darted to the side, keeping himself between the man and the kitten. The man, frustrated now, swung again, this time grazing Theo's side. The dog let out a sharp yelp of pain but didn't retreat. He couldn't. He wouldn't. The kitten's cries grew louder, piercing through the storm. It didn't understand what was happening, but it could sense the danger. Theo turned his head for a brief moment, looking back at the little creature. His eyes softened despite the pain radiating through his body. He was telling the kitten something without words. "Stay. I've got this." And then, just as the man raised the rod for a third strike, a voice called out from the distance. "Hey, what are you doing?" The man froze, his hand mid-swing. Down the alley, a woman appeared, her umbrella nearly blown inside out by the wind. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with a face full of concern. Her name was Sophia, a waitress at the diner just down the street. She had seen Theo before. How could she not? He often lingered near the back door of the diner, waiting patiently for leftover scraps. She had even sneaked him a piece of bacon once or twice, though she knew her boss wouldn't approve. Sophia's eyes darted from the man to the dog, then to the tiny kitten cowering behind him. It didn't take her long to piece together what was happening. Her heart clenched at the sight of Theo, his side already bruised from the man's strike. And at the kitten, so small and fragile it seemed like it might break under the weight of the world. "Get away from them," Sophia shouted, her voice firm and unwavering despite the fear bubbling inside her. She wasn't particularly brave, but something about the scene lit a fire in her chest. These animals couldn't defend themselves, not against someone like him. But she could. The man glared at her, clearly annoyed. "Mind your own business," he snapped, but Sophia didn't back down. She stepped closer, her grip tightening on the umbrella as if it could serve as her own weapon. "They're just animals," he added, as if that somehow justified his actions. "And you're a coward," Sophia shot back, her voice trembling slightly but her stance resolute. "Now get out of here before I call the police." The man hesitated. His eyes darted to the dog, then to Sophia, and finally back down the alley. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and it was clear that this wasn't going to end in his favor. With a grunt of frustration, he threw the rod to the ground and stormed off, muttering curses under his breath. As soon as he disappeared into the shadows, Sophia rushed to Theo and the kitten. She crouched down, her umbrella forgotten on the wet ground. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hands hovering over Theo's battered side. "You poor thing." Theo didn't move at first. He was still on high alert, his body trembling from both the cold and the adrenaline. But when Sophia gently reached out, her voice soft and soothing, he finally relaxed. His legs buckled slightly, and he let out a deep sigh, his head lowering in exhaustion. And the kitten? The tiny creature let out a weak meow, its eyes blinking up at Sophia. It was soaked, its little body shivering uncontrollably. Without thinking, Sophia scooped it up, cradling it against her chest. It let out another tiny cry, but when it felt her warmth, it quieted. Sophia looked down at Theo, her heart breaking all over again. "You protected it?" she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Even when it meant putting yourself in danger, she reached out again, this time stroking the wet fur on his head. Theo flinched slightly, but didn't pull away. He looked up at her with eyes that held so much, a mix of gratitude, relief, and a silent plea for help. "You're coming with me," Sophia said firmly, as if there were no other option. She shifted the kitten to one arm and used the other to coax Theo to his feet. "Both of you. Liking the story so far? Comment dog and kitten to show that you like it. And comment where are you from? I want to know." The rain continued to pour as Sophia led them out of the alley, her footsteps splashing through puddles. She didn't know how she was going to take care of them. Her apartment barely had room for herself, let alone a dog and a kitten. But as she glanced down at Theo limping beside her, and the kitten nestled against her chest, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't leave them behind. Sophia's small, one-bedroom apartment wasn't much to look at. The walls were painted a dull beige, and the furniture was a mismatched collection of thrift store finds. But to Theo and the kitten, it was a sanctuary. The warm, dry air greeted them as Sophia opened the door and ushered them inside. "All right," she said softly, setting the kitten down on a folded blanket she had hastily laid on the floor. "Let's get you two cleaned up." The kitten let out a weak mewl, its tiny body still trembling from the cold. Theo stood nearby, watching Sophia closely, his body stiff and hesitant. He didn't trust people easily, not anymore. But something about her gentle voice and the way she looked at them with such care made him stay. Sophia disappeared into the bathroom and returned with a towel and a small bowl of warm water. She crouched next to the kitten, carefully wiping away the dirt and grime matted into its fur. "There we go," she murmured, her voice as soft as a lullaby. The kitten seemed to relax under her touch, its trembling slowing as it nestled deeper into the blanket. Once the kitten was clean and dry, Sophia turned her attention to Theo. His golden fur was soaked through, and now that she could see him clearly, the bruise on his side made her wince. "You've been through so much," she whispered. Theo flinched slightly as she reached out with the towel, but when she didn't force him, he stepped closer on his own. Slowly, she began to dry him off, her movements careful and deliberate. As the evening wore on, Sophia found herself sitting on the floor between the two animals. The kitten was curled up in her lap, fast asleep, while Theo lay just a few feet away, his eyes half closed but still watching her. "You're amazing, you know that?" she said, her voice breaking the comfortable silence. "What you did for this little one, most people wouldn't even do that." Theo's ears twitched at her words, and for the first time, Sophia saw his tail wag, just a little, but enough to make her smile. The next few days brought a whirlwind of challenges. Sophia wasn't exactly equipped to care for a dog and a kitten, but she did the best she could. She took Theo to the vet, using the tips she had earned at the diner to pay for his examination. "You're lucky," the vet told her. "He's bruised, but there's no serious damage. A few weeks of rest, and he'll be good as new." The kitten, however, was another story. "It's severely malnourished," the vet said, frowning as they weighed the tiny creature. "You'll need to feed it every few hours, and even then, it's going to be a fight to get it strong again." Sophia nodded, determined. She wasn't going to let this little life slip away, not after all Theo had done to protect it. And so, their new life together began. Sophia juggled her shifts at the diner with caring for the animals. She would wake up in the middle of the night to feed the kitten, its tiny cries echoing through the apartment. Theo, ever watchful, would sit by her side, his eyes never leaving the kitten. He had taken on the role of protector so naturally, as if it had been his purpose all along. But not everything was smooth. The memories of that night in the alley lingered like shadows in Sophia's mind. She couldn't forget the way the man had raised that metal rod or the yelp Theo had let out when he was struck. And Theo, too, seemed haunted. Whenever they went outside, he would tense at the sound of footsteps behind them. The world hadn't been kind to him. and it would take time for him to believe that it could be different. The kitten, on the other hand, began to thrive under their care. Its once bony frame filled out and its fur grew soft and fluffy. Sophia decided to name it Ollie, short for olive, because its tiny green eyes reminded her of the olive trees her grandmother used to talk about. Theo and Ollie became inseparable. Wherever Theo went, the kitten followed, its little paws scurrying to keep up with his larger strides. And Theo, ever patient, would stop and wait, as if he understood that Ollie was still learning how to navigate the world. The turning point came one crisp morning when Sophia decided to take Theo and Ollie to the park. She thought it might be good for them, especially Theo. He had spent so much time protecting Ollie and recovering from his injuries that he hadn't had a chance to simply be a dog. The park was quiet, the grass still damp with dew. Sophia carried Ollie in a small basket lined with a blanket, while Theo walked beside her, his leash loose in her hand. At first, he seemed hesitant, his eyes scanning their surroundings as if expecting danger. But as they made their way deeper into the park, something shifted. A group of children ran past them, laughing and tossing a frisbee. Theo's ears perked up, and for a moment, Sophia saw a flicker of his former self, the carefree dog he must have been before life had turned on him. She crouched down, gently stroking his head. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're safe now." And then, as if he understood her words, Theo did something that took Sophia completely by surprise. He barked, not the sharp, defensive bark she had heard in the alley, but a playful bark, full of energy and excitement. He bounded forward, his tail wagging furiously, and Sophia laughed as he chased after the children, the leash slipping from her hand. Ollie, watching from the basket, let out a tiny meow, as if cheering Theo on. Sophia couldn't help but smile, her heart swelling at the sight of the dog finally letting go of his fear, even if just for a moment. As Theo played, Sophia noticed a man approaching her, a park ranger, judging by his uniform. He had a kind face, with deep lines that spoke of years spent outdoors. "That your dog?" he asked, nodding toward Theo. Sophia hesitated. "Kind of. He's a stray, or he was. I guess he's mine now." The ranger smiled. "Looks like he's lucky to have found you. Dogs like him. They don't give up easily, and from the looks of it, neither do you." Sophia felt her cheeks flush. "It's not just me," she said, glancing at Ollie in the basket. "He's the one who saved the kitten. I'm just trying to keep up." The ranger chuckled. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep at it. They're both lucky to have you." As the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the park, Sophia watched Theo and Ollie together. The dog who had found purpose in protecting another life, and the kitten who had given him a reason to keep going. She realized then that they had all saved each other in their own way. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. What had started as a fragile, unlikely trio, Sophia, Theo, and little Ollie, had grown into a family. The transformation in Theo was the most remarkable. He no longer flinched at sudden noises or cowered when strangers approached. His once matted coat now gleamed golden in the sunlight, and his tail wagged freely, a constant reminder of how far he'd come. But even as he embraced his new life, his protective nature remained. Wherever Ollie went, Theo followed, always keeping a watchful eye on the tiny kitten who had somehow become his whole world. Ollie, too, had changed. The frail, trembling creature that Theo had once shielded from the rain was now a spirited ball of energy. He would pounce on Theo's tail, climb onto his back, and even playfully bat at Theo's ears. And Theo, patient as ever, let him. It was as if Theo understood that Ollie's antics were the kitten's way of saying, "I'm alive because of you." Sophia watched their bond grow with a kind of awe. She had seen friendships before, between humans, between animals, but there was something extraordinary about Theo and Ollie. They weren't just friends, they were survivors, two souls who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances and had refused to let go. But the world has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. It happened one evening, just as the sun was setting and the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink. Sophia had taken Theo and Ollie to the park for their usual evening walk. It had become their routine, Ollie riding in a small carrier slung across Sophia's shoulder, while Theo trotted happily by her side. As they walked, Sophia noticed a commotion near the edge of the park. A group of teenagers had gathered, their voices loud and taunting. She couldn't see what was happening, but something about their laughter made her uneasy. Theo, too, sensed it. His ears perked up and his body tensed. When they got closer, Sophia's heart sank. The teenagers were standing in a circle, and in the middle was a small, frightened dog. It was younger than Theo, with scruffy black fur and wide, terrified eyes. The dog cowered as the teenagers threw small rocks and sticks, laughing each time it flinched. "Hey!" Sophia shouted, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. The teenagers turned to look at her, their laughter faltering. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Theo growled low in his throat, stepping in front of Sophia as if to shield her from the group. One of the teenagers, a lanky boy with a baseball cap, sneered. "It's just a stray," he said dismissively. "Why do you care?" "Because it's wrong," Sophia snapped. Her voice was shaking, but she stood her ground. "Leave it alone, or I'll call the cops." The teenagers hesitated, glancing at each other. Theo let out a sharp bark, his stance firm and his eyes locked on them. It was enough to send them scattering, their bravado evaporating as they ran off into the distance. Sophia rushed to the small dog, kneeling down to check if it was hurt. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice soothing. The dog whimpered, but when Sophia extended her hand, it didn't pull away. It was dirty and thin, much like Theo had been when she first found him. Its fur was patchy in places, and there was a deep sadness in its eyes. Theo approached slowly, his movements deliberate. He sniffed the small dog, his tail wagging gently as if to say, "You're safe now." And then something extraordinary happened. Ollie, who had been watching from his carrier, let out a determined meow. Sophia opened the carrier and the kitten climbed out, padding over to the new dog with surprising confidence. Ollie rubbed against the dog's side, purring loudly, and for the first time, the dog relaxed. Sophia couldn't hold back her tears. It was as if Theo and Ollie had taken the lessons they had learned from their own pain and were now passing them on to another lost soul. They understood, in a way only survivors could, what it meant to be scared and alone. And just like that, their little family grew by one more. The weeks that followed were a blur of adjustments. The new dog, whom Sophia named Shadow, was shy and timid at first. It flinched at loud noises and would hide whenever someone new entered the apartment. But Theo and Ollie were relentless in their efforts to make Shadow feel at home. Theo would lie beside Shadow, his presence a calming force, while Ollie played the role of mischievous little sibling, coaxing Shadow out of its shell with playful pounces and headbutts. Sophia marveled at how naturally Theo took on the role of leader. He had gone from being a stray, lost and scared, to the heart of their family. He was patient with Shadow, just as he had been with Ollie, and slowly but surely, Shadow began to trust. One evening, as they all lounged in the living room, Sophia looked at Theo, Ollie, and Shadow curled up together on the rug. The sight brought a lump to her throat. They were a patchwork family, each with their own scars and stories, but they had found something that so many people spent their entire lives searching for: unconditional love. Theo's story didn't stay confined to Sophia's small apartment. One day, while scrolling through her phone, Sophia decided to post about what had happened in the alley all those months ago. She shared how Theo had risked his life to protect Ollie, how their bond had inspired her to take them in, and how they had since rescued Shadow. She didn't think much of it at the time, but within days, her post went viral. People from all over the country reached out, moved by Theo's courage and the incredible bond between the animals. Donations poured in to help Sophia care for them, and local news outlets picked up the story. "Hero Dog Saves Kitten, Inspires Community," one headline read. But Sophia wasn't interested in fame. What mattered to her was that Theo, Ollie, and Shadow were happy, healthy, and safe. Still, the attention brought opportunities she never expected. A local animal shelter invited her to speak at an event about the importance of adopting strays. Standing on the small stage with Theo, Ollie, and Shadow by her side, Sophia shared their story, her voice trembling with emotion. "These animals saved each other," she said, looking down at Theo, who was sitting proudly at her feet. "And they saved me too. They taught me that love and kindness can heal even the deepest wounds." The audience erupted in applause, but Sophia's eyes were on Theo. He looked up at her, his tail wagging, and in that moment she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the small park where Sophia, Theo, Ollie, and Shadow now spent their evenings. Sophia sat on a worn wooden bench, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee as she watched the trio play in the grass. Theo, ever the guardian, kept a close eye on Ollie, who darted around with kitten-like energy, chasing fallen leaves. Shadow, once so timid and withdrawn, now joined in the play, running in circles with a wagging tail, barking softly as if laughing for the first time. Sophia's heart swelled with pride and gratitude. She thought back to that rainy night in the alley when Theo stood between a cruel world and a tiny, defenseless kitten. At the time, she hadn't known how much that moment would change her life. What began as an act of bravery and selflessness had blossomed into something beautiful, a family stitched together by love, resilience, and second chances. Theo turned to look at her, his amber eyes filled with a depth of understanding that only a dog like him could possess. He trotted over, his tail wagging, and rested his head on her lap. She stroked his soft fur, tears welling up in her eyes. "You're my hero," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved all of us." As if understanding her words, Theo licked her hand and then looked back at Ollie and Shadow, his family, his purpose. In that moment, Sophia realized something profound. Theo wasn't just a dog who had once been abandoned and lost. He was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even the most broken souls could find their way back to joy and love. The story of Theo, Ollie, and Shadow didn't end in that park. It lived on in the hearts of everyone who heard it. A story about courage, kindness, and the unbreakable bonds we can form when we choose to care for one another. Sophia knew that life would still bring challenges, but she also knew they would face them together as a family. Because sometimes the greatest heroes aren't the ones who wear capes, they're the ones who stand in the rain, protecting what matters most.